Welcome to Friday Forum. Today is September 12th, 2025. This is the 233rd Friday Forum in this series. The series is hosted by ICLR, the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction. We're Canada's leading source for disaster resilience knowledge. Our mission is to make Canada more resilient to natural disasters. So each month, we present recent research related to that mission. I'm your host, ICLR Chief Engineer, Dr. Keith Porter. I'm speaking to you from Berkeley, California. This is the territory of the Huichin, the original landscape of the Ohlone people, the successors of the sovereign Verona Band of Alameda County. Last month, we heard about an Australian model that uses radar data to estimate insured losses in a hailstorm. That was a general effort of the Australian Bureau of Meteorology and Suncorp, which is a large Australian general insurer. If you missed it, you can watch the recording. You can find the video of that seminar and the speaker's decks and transcript at www.iclr.org/workshops. And you can find all our other Friday Fora there too. In next month's Friday Forum, Tina Neal will tell us about BC's disaster and climate risk and resilience assessment. That's going to be on Friday, October 10th, 2025. Today, it's our pleasure to host CAL FIRE Deputy Director Frank Bigelow. Chief Bigelow is going to talk about two things. First, he's going to tell us about California's newly adopted Wildland-Urban Interface Code, which applies to new construction. Second, he's going to tell us about California's recently released Fire Hazard Severity Zone Maps, which complement the new building code. Now, here's why I think that's interesting. In prior research, the National Institute of Building Sciences found that compliance with the International Wildland-Urban Interface Code makes new buildings cost less in the long run. They cost a little bit more upfront to make them more resistant to ignition, but the added upfront cost of construction is more than counterbalanced by the avoided future losses. That code saves, we estimated, $3 for every $1 of added cost. And the benefits are higher in higher hazard locations. Canada doesn't have that advantage. Partly as a result, in Canada, we get catastrophes like Jasper and Lytton. Those fires destroyed 30% of Jasper and 99% of Lytton. Now, perhaps home buyers benefited from lower upfront costs in those two communities from the code not paying that much attention to the wildfire hazard. Though some research casts doubt on that savings. But whatever savings they enjoyed at the purchase vanished with those fires. The most affordable home is the one that doesn't burn down. And that's the problem that California has addressed with this new code. And second, about the fire hazard severity maps, California maps wildfire hazard to the level of the city block, as we'll see today. So California builds fire-resistant buildings where it matters. Canada doesn't have those either. After Chief Bigelow speaks, I'm going to ask how many of us would like the same things in Canada. Now, before our speaker begins, here's our agenda. Our webinar is going to last 90 minutes. Our speaker is going to present for about half that time, 30, 40 minutes. Then I'm going to moderate Q&A for the rest of the time. Please feel free to chat your questions into the Q&A box, not the chat box, but the Q&A box. And then I'm going to try to pose your questions in the order that they appear in the Q&A box. We don't unmute people to ask their questions. I just relate them to our speaker. If we have a lot of questions, I may only pose your first question, and then I'm going to move on to others. Then I'll circle back to your additional questions. Our webinar is recorded, and ICLR is going to post our speaker's slides and a link to the video in the next day or so. If you have colleagues who couldn't attend, let them know, and you can find those slides and so on and the video at www.iclr.org/workshops. And with that, I will turn it over to Chief Bigelow. Take it away, Chief.
All right. Good morning. Thanks, Keith. I appreciate that introduction and overview of what we plan to talk about. You know, those are two of the primary topics that we'll talk about, but I do have a whole host of other related topics that I plan to dive a little bit deep into, just to give you kind of full context about what those two things that Keith mentioned about the building code and fire hazard severity zones mean and what relates to those two things. So as mentioned, my name is Frank Bigelow, and I'm a deputy director with CAL FIRE out of the Office of the State Fire Marshal. And so we're going to dive into a little bit here about who the State Fire Marshal's office is. This is our executive leadership from the Office of the State Fire Marshal. We just recently hired the vacant position. Haven't got his headshot yet, and I forgot to update his vacant, but it's Tim Spears is the vacant position you see down there. But Chief Berland is our State Fire Marshal. Myself and Vicky Sakamoto are the two deputy directors. Chief Sakamoto is the title of Assistant State Fire Marshal. And then we have another level of assistant deputy directors who help us do all of the things that we do in the office. The office is made up of 7 different divisions. We're really going to focus today on the Community Wildfire Preparedness and Mitigation Division, of which I have the pleasure of supporting, as well as the Fire Engineering and Investigations divisions toward the bottom right of the circles. But we also, as the State Fire Marshal's office, we set all the standards for the building code and the fire code in the fire code through our code development and analysis team. So in the top left there, our state fire training going around to the left sets the curriculum for all the fire service in the state of California. So they do the development of the curriculum, and they set the standards for training, and they have certified instructors all across the state. They teach over 35,000 different students a year through multiple different trainings. We also oversee 5,000 miles of pipeline through the state of California for liquid petroleum-based products. And then coming around to our Fire and Life Safety Division, all of the state-owned buildings or leased buildings, our office inspects for compliance with life safety measures, whether that's panic hardware or fire extinguishers or sprinklers or automatic extinguishing systems. The Fire and Life Safety team works through plan review, implementation, new construction, and that's thousands and thousands of buildings that the state owns or leases across the state. And all of this happens out of or under the umbrella of CAL FIRE. Although we are a small office, CAL FIRE is made up of almost 15,000 people, and the Office of the State Fire makes up about 313 of those. So all of these functions that I just mentioned happens with a relatively small staff across the state. So just kind of give you a framing of who the State Fire Marshal is and some of the things that we do. So specifically kind of diving into the CWPM or Community Wildfire Preparedness and Mitigation Division, some of the things we do there are defensible space and home hardening. And that may be a term that most of you know, some of you may not. Home hardening refers to the retrofitting of homes in the state responsibility area or any area for that matter. They want to make their home more wildfire resilient. And we'll talk about Part 7 that's coming up in January, right now known as Chapter 7A of the Building Code, that provides for those wildfire resistant building construction materials and what that means. But what retrofitting means is taking those homes that weren't to that standard and trying to bring them up to that standard. So that's what home hardening means. We also are the state's liaisons for NFPAs, the National Fire Protection Administration, their FireWise communities. So it's kind of a grassroots effort, it's a recognition where people in communities and neighborhoods can come together and define an area, come up with an action plan, and do volunteer hours to increase the level of wildfire resilience in their neighborhood, and then thus becoming a FireWise community. Some insurance companies look at FireWise as a good thing and help provide them with some assurance that they're taking measures and proactive measures to become more wildfire resilient. We have now eclipsed, since this graphic was made, 1,344. This was all of 2024 stats. So we've in 2025 already raised up to 1,344 FireWise communities in good standing, which is 43% of the nation's total right here in the state of California. So a monumental task for our staff and those communities working on those. We also do online burn permits. We do land use planning. So our staff works with local jurisdictions on the safety element of their general plan when they're developing new communities, and we have a seat at the table to help make recommendations as subject matter experts in wildfire safety, and ensuring that when building these new communities, they're adhering to the minimum fire safe regulations for everything from road widths, gate widths, road capacities, water flow, all of those life safety and fire safety measures that they're being incorporated into the development of those new construction communities. We also collect and capture all the fuels reduction work that's out in the state. So anytime our crews or our grant crews that go out and conduct work on the landscape, it's our office that records that and then reports on those acres. We also give out anywhere between $100 and $135 million a year in the form of local assistance through wildfire prevention grants. And those things cover things like education grants, or the development of documents like community wildfire protection plans, or CWPPs, local hazard mitigation plans, or the cultivation development of the safety elements that local jurisdictions can apply for additional funding to do that. But it also funds fuels reduction. So if a 501c3 organization applied, they can then contract with services to conduct fuels reduction. That could be right-of-way clearance along an ingress and egress. It could be just thinning out some fuels, or creating a fuel break around communities to protect communities from oncoming fire. So that, in a small nutshell, is what CWPM is. We also have a newly created portion of our division, which is our Community Risk Reduction Program. We're really excited about this. This is a powerful team of one at the moment. Her name's Kara Garrett. She's fantastic. And this is really taking all of the data that we've captured over the years from every aspect of what the office does, and putting those into statistics and easily absorbable information for the public, and putting it out on every platform that we possibly can. Everything from how many smoke alarms saved lives last year, how many Christmas tree fires resulted in a catastrophic loss of a structure, to just kind of reinforce those things as we go through the year, and about when to change your batteries in your smoke alarms. Just constantly reminding people about reducing the risk in a community through education and through data, and that we can back up with the numbers to say we're seeing a huge trend in this, and people need to be aware of this. So all those letter E's you see at the bottom: engineering, economic incentive, enforcement, emergency response, education, are kind of the pillars for our community risk reduction program. So that's a little bit about the office and who we are, and directly about CWPM. We're going to transition to something a little bit more somber on the next slide. And this we can attest to and back this up after fire, is that homes that ignite by wildfire have a greater than 90% chance of completely burning down. And the reason for that is there just aren't enough resources in the form of fire engines or fire personnel or aircraft to put one at every single home on every fire. The fastest way to save homes, save lives, save critical infrastructure and natural resources is to put the fire out. And if we were to put resources at every single home, the fire would continue to burn without anybody trying to put it out. So we have to make operational and strategic and tactical decisions on where to put fire engines and how to suppress the fire most quickly. So, knowing that, I'm going to talk a little bit now about fire hazard severity zones, about what they are. So the fire hazard severity zones are maps that are required by law. So this is the California Code of Regulations 1280 and Public Resources Code 1401 through 1404 in the state responsibility area. Then in the California Code of Regulations 1290, or excuse me, 1280.2 and Government Code 51178 through 179, that defines what happens in the local responsibility area. And to kind of define, there are three different areas within the state. They're broken up into three distinctly different areas. Local responsibility area, which is kind of like your urban development, where it has incorporated cities and clearly defined boundaries of where that is. That would be the local responsibility area. Moving out into the unincorporated areas of a county, that becomes the state responsibility area for wildland fire protection. And then beyond that, when you move past the state responsibility area into the more forested lands, that becomes the responsibility of the United States Forest Service or federal entities like Bureau of Land Management, Bureau of Indian Affairs, National Park Service, and other federal landowners that protect those resources in the federal area. So it's important to note, with respect to fire hazard severity zones, that our maps map hazard and not risk. Oftentimes, those words get used interchangeably and conflated to mean the same thing, but they don't. They are not the same thing. Hazard relates to the physical conditions on the ground, and things like slope, aspect, weather, to a certain degree, the fuels surrounding the area, and they are meant to be long-term planning efforts, long-term planning maps. And risk is really defined as those things that you can mitigate. So doing home hardening, doing defensible space, those things where you could live in a very high fire hazard severity zone, but have relatively no risk because you've taken the measures to reduce that risk around your home, cleared the vegetation, brought the undergrowth up so that if a ground fire comes along, it doesn't make it into the treetops. You've changed out your windows from single pane to multi-pane, multi-tempered. You've put on non-combustible siding. You've put on different vents that went from a 1/4 inch, was a previously accepted before Chapter 7A, and now it's an 1/8 inch. So if you've replaced those things, so you can really drop your risk associated with wildfire down, but you're never going to eliminate the hazard associated with where you live. If you're in a very high fire hazard severity zone, there's almost absent completely leveling an area and completely rebuilding it with a master planned community and creating multiple 100 feet of buffers around those communities. That's really the only way you're going to lower the hazard in that area, which would trigger, when we mapped this last iteration, we looked at every map we possibly could to determine where those had happened and incorporated that in our model. And in the state responsibility area, there was the ability to have a back and forth with the public, because there's a process with the Office of Administrative Law to provide public comment that we had to be responsive to. And we had thousands of comments from people, everything from "we hate you, you're raising our insurance," to "this is great," or this "hey, this doesn't really look quite right here. We have this other weather model. Can you take a look at this?" And we did. We looked at those. And in some areas, there were microclimates that had two different climates that converged in a certain area that we incorporated, and it did modify the way that the map or the model interacted with those, and in some cases raised the level of hazard, and in other areas it lowered the hazard. So we did take that into account. In the local responsibility area, unfortunately, the government code doesn't allow for that process. It just says that as soon as we produce the draft map, of which we iterated on multiple times internally, and we pass that on to the local jurisdiction, then they are either choose to adopt by ordinance that map, that draft map, or they can change it by adding to what we did, but they can't take away. So what these maps do is they identify 3 levels of hazard: moderate, high, and very high. And those are delineated here in the map by the yellow as moderate, orange as high, and then the dark red as very high. So what are these maps for? Why do we even put the maps out? Well, they are for building standards for new construction in the Wildland-Urban Interface. There's also a component of the Natural Hazard Real Estate Disclosure from Assembly Bill 38 a few years ago, 2019 or 2020, I believe, from 1102.19 for home sales transactions, and then I think it's 0.20 or 0.21 of 1102.1102. That now there's a natural hazards real estate disclosure, and there's also another disclosure that you're required to let the buyer know of any additional features that you've done to make your home more well safe, so that buyer can make an informed decisions. It also helps us identify, which I mentioned, the minimum fire safe regulations. So the property development standards, as I mentioned, the road supply, the road widths, the water supply, and the signage related to that. So this graph kind of gives you an idea of what applies where. So if we look in the top left here, in the very high, and this is in the local responsibility area, these things apply. So most notably, Chapter 7A of the Building Code. So for all new construction, they need to be built to a wildfire resilient standard. The state minimum fire safe regulations and defensible space. So that's governed by Government Code 51182 that defines what defensible space is for the local responsibility area. And then there's some other things here that, as I mentioned, on those hazard disclosures and real estate compliance. For the state responsibility area, all these things apply all the way down. So everything you see here in the very high applies everywhere in the state responsibility area, regardless of which fire hazard severity zone you are in. So as we go back to the local responsibility area, if you're in the high, those the fire hazard severity zones are required to be mapped per two pieces of legislation that happened in the same year. There were actually three that were requiring us to do this. One of them didn't pass, two of them did, so that's how much they really wanted this to be done. But applying in January 1st of 2026, Chapter 7A will become required for new building construction in the high as a result of Part 7. So this will now switch from Chapter 7A to Part 7, which we'll talk more about in a little while. The defensible space real estate compliance, you'll see that both here in the high and the very high of the local responsibility area. As we transition down to the moderate in the local responsibility area, we were asked in this legislation of SB 63 from 2021 to consider with other partners to determine whether we believe that the moderate should be included in having to do Chapter 7A of the Building Code, soon to be Part 7. So those discussions are ongoing. But as you can see in the model we use, the state responsibility area requires everything. The local responsibility area that uses the same exact model, that presents the same exact level of hazard in the SRA, has a differing level or differing tier of requirements. And what we're trying to do is try to bring these two more in alignment as we work toward the future of what codes and regulations and statute look like. So how are these zones determined? We used a science-based model that assigns a hazard score, and it's based on the likelihood of fire likelihood and fire behavior. So some of the factors we include are fire history, of course, vegetation, the topography is very important, climate, and ember production movement. Some of the new things that we added when we originally did this back in 2007, we didn't have as sophisticated modeling capabilities or as robust layers that we could draw from, and we didn't have as deep a level of understanding of that we do now. So some of the things we added were updated burn probabilities for wildland areas, and then updated the fire environment footprints. So what we mean by that is urban and developed. So what I talked about earlier is we scoured the state to find out all these places that had new developments in them to try to be as accurate and up to date as we could to ensure that those that did make urban developments where there's now a Target or a Walmart or another huge facility that then, because it's now paved or has concrete and huge buildings on it, does change the hazard in that area. So we want to make sure we were inclusive of that. We updated our vegetation density for the urban areas. We used a much more accurate, robust data layer that we were able to source to ensure that our vegetation layer was as accurate as we could possibly be. We included the slope in the urban zoning model, which wasn't included previously. So in the previous iteration in an axis of like, it was just zero. There was no plus for anything for slope in the urban zoning model, which led to, I'll just say, not as accurate mapping as what we have today. We really in that scenario where we got public comment back about the microclimates, we wanted to ensure that we were using the most accuracy, because unlike how the law is written for Public Resources Code 4291, that says that when determining defensible space, we have to do that under average weather conditions. Well, there's no such stipulation in fire hazard severity zones. So we use the worst possible weather to determine the zones, because as we saw in Southern California in January, that was the worst possible weather. There are 100-mile-per-hour winds. Like, if we were to just use our model based on average weather conditions, we would never capture that type of event related to our maps. And it's in planning and zoning and doing mitigations moving forward. So we have to use the worst possible scenario in weather when determining these maps. We also, and finally in this slide, added a new firebrand production transport model. So what that means is how far are embers going to travel? And we only look at vegetation. So right now there are people working on urban conflagration models, looking at house-to-house ignition. Our maps do not do that. They do not incorporate homes or structures as a fuel. We are only taking into consideration the actual fuel on the landscape to determine fire spread and ember production and distance. So when you see our maps, if you go look at our newest map as an example in Altadena, you'll see that the fire traveled further into the community of Altadena than our zones. Once the fire started going house to house, it no longer became a vegetation fire and became an urban conflagration fire, moving house to house, again, which we don't model as a part of the fire hazard severity zones. So that's why you saw that fire move further in than where our zones map. So just as an example, or to kind of emphasize the wildland versus non-wildland zones, we look at basically 200 acres with relative homogeneous slope and vegetation to try to be as consistent as we possibly can in things that are the same. And the hazard map is produced at a 30-meter resolution, and we average those scores. And then the wildland score is independent of the urban and agriculture. So we broke those kind of up into those different categories, where wildland is specifically identified differently and scored independently from what we would in a more urban or agricultural environment. And then the urban zones scored using additional model steps as well, because we had to take into account additional factors. So where can we find the fire hazard severity zone information? So our data package is available for download to provide clarification on our website. You can see there at the bottom bullet. I encourage any of you that have more questions related to fire hazard severity zones to go on that website. We have a robust frequently asked questions document. We have multiple videos that we produced on there that go into the history of fire hazard severity zones and why that happened, from the tunnel fire in Oakland Hills in the 90s and going back to the Bates Bill and going all the way through the history of how this came to be and why it came to be. And then our scientists who helped develop the model and turned to the scientific community to ensure that our standards and our model stood up to that peer review test. All of that's on our website. The data sets are formatted in ArcGIS software configuration. So if anybody wants to go pull down the data that we use, pull down the layers, they're welcome to do that. The map package shows all the changes. And then there's an updated web viewer as well for both the state responsibility area, the local responsibility area. There's a swipe tool to be able to see before and after. So again, I encourage all of you to take a look at that website, and it will answer almost all of your questions. Okay, so we're going to transition a little bit about, now we talked about fire hazard severity zones, but and we talked about the graph, the green and yellow graph that showed the things that are happen. Well, here's what happens as a result of fire hazard severity zones: the implementation of defensible space. And the newest thing related to defensible space is Zone 0. So as some of you probably know, the governor issued an executive order earlier this year, post the LA fires, to get ensure that the Zone 0 regulations were done by January 1st of 2026. So the Board of Forestry and Fire Protection, not to be confused with the Department of Forestry and Fire Protection, separate entities, is charged with the propagation of the regulation for Zone 0 in consultation with CAL FIRE or the Department of Forestry and Fire Protection. So we're providing feedback and helping them through this with some subject matter expertise. But what this in essence is going to do, for years, we've had this first dashed line around here that goes all the way around. This is known as Zone 1 in this area. So Zone 1 was the first 30 feet around your home. Then beyond that, this next area, this next dash zone that kind of goes to the fence line and comes around, is known as Zone 2. And different things apply in those areas. The reduction of fuel, creating horizontal and vertical, or eliminating horizontal and vertical continuity, meaning spacing things out so that they don't transfer from plant to plant or from tree to tree, leading directly to your home. There's things like making sure that around your propane tank, you've cleared 10 feet down to bare mineral soil, and then you've reduced the fuel load beyond that. The same thing for sheds or outbuildings near your home. But more importantly, back to Zone 0, is this is the first 5 feet immediately around your home. And this is so important because a lot of us keep what I call junk. My team says I can't say that. They say treasures. People keep a lot of treasures around their home, right up next to their home, that are combustible. And when your home's being pelted by, and I have a slide to illustrate this later on, by embers and things that are ignitable or that are igniting, that are in the air, that are floating or being wind driven toward your home, and then you have all these things, treasures, next to your house that are ignitable, now your home becomes almost defenseless against this, because now those things ignite, they create a tremendous amount of heat energy, and most homes can't withstand that if they're not built to a wildfire resilient standard or have non-combustible siding, non-combustible roofing, those types of extra protections. So Zone 0 is being worked on now. If you go on the Board of Forestry's website, there's the draft language, the latest rule plead that's on there. You can read it through for yourself about what that means. Some of the things are, keeping trees trimmed up 5 feet above the roof line, keeping them 5 feet away from the home, making sure that you don't have any combustible materials under vents, under windows around your house, and understanding that this is one of the biggest changes we've made to defensible space in a long time. And it's very emotional for a lot of people, because when they purchased their home, they purchased it because they loved it the way it was. And they may have been there for 10, 20, 30, even longer. And they've cultivated that, they've curated it, they've taken care of, they've managed it. And now we're saying, hey, what you've done here is beautiful, but you can't have it. Like, you've got to get rid of this stuff. It can't be next to your home. And that's going to be a tough sell for a lot of us. But what the science has proven is this is the most important area around our home to help prevent these catastrophic events and this urban conflagration from continuing on from home to home. What it really does is help protect from ember production, because embers can, in Australia, they had embers that went up to 6 miles ahead of the main fire. So when you're getting that type of ember production that far out, your chances of your home surviving with all of those things around it, start to diminish. And so it's going to be a bit of a culture change. And I'll just tell you anecdotally, I told my parents about this when this law first passed. It was a Freedman bill, AB 3074, which defined this. I told my parents that this is coming, and my dad was like, "The hell we are! We paid a lot of money for that landscaping. I'm not getting rid of it." And my mom was like, "Yes, I finally get to get rid of all that crap in the front, and I get to put up a nice patio and a swing that I've always wanted." I was like, "Well, as long as it's non-combustible." So the emotions run the gamut. Of course, my dad, he's a law-abiding citizen. He would be like, "Okay, that's just the initial emotion and reaction to something that's new." So we understand that, and Senate Bill 504 extended the timeline for which this will go into effect. So for new construction, it'll go into effect for enforcement on January 1, or when the regulation is propagated. So as soon as that regulation is propagated, it will go into effect for new construction. For the built environment, it'll be 1 year. It'll go into effect, but it won't be enforced for 3 years. So it'll be January 1, 2029 that we would start the enforcement process for Zone 0 on the built environment, giving people time to understand and adjust and make plans for what's coming. So transitioning a little bit now to home hardening, just to reinforce those things that I talked about what that means. Some of the most important things are non-combustible fencing. What we've seen time and time again are these wooden fences that you get a fire that starts out here in this open space. It moves toward the fence catches on fire, and then it travels down the fence, along the fence line, and assuming this is still all wood, it leads it directly to the home. And it happens time and time again. And what we're doing with this is interrupting that fuel and ensuring that this does not have enough heat energy in it to transition to this home. Also, hardscaping around the house to ensure that there's no ignitable material near or around the house. We want to make sure we have enclosed eaves, a Class A roof with non-combustible gutters and covers. We want to make sure those vents in the gable ends and any other vents around the home are 1/8 inch, multi-pane windows with tempered panes. And if you don't know the difference between a tempered and non-tempered pane, if you've ever seen a windshield crack, it cracks and goes into pieces. That's kind of the same thing as what a tempered glass does. It doesn't break in shards and fall out. It has a laminate material in it that helps make it stay intact, and it can take a tremendous amount of heat energy. And when you have multi-pane, you just extend the ability for that window to take heat next to it so that it doesn't fall out and it doesn't allow those embers to get in. Another recommendation we're making to people as a best practice is not vinyl windows. Vinyl framed windows have a tendency to sag and when exposed to heat, and then ultimately the frame starts to fall out. So ideally, not a vinyl window. And then, of course, non-combustible siding. This is one of the most important pieces as well. And then, as you can see, this 0 to 5 foot non-combustible material around the house. So some of the home hardening efforts that we're working on, and one of the things that we'll just spend a second on, is our WUI building codes. So as you may or may not know, we have Chapter 7A of the Building Code. It went into effect July 1st of 2010. And what that did was this huge paradigm shift of how we built homes to a more wildfire resilient standard. And it requires things like fire resistive siding and Class A roof and multi-pane windows. So since 2010, we've had a lot of these things. We've made some adjustments, refinements, updates, and following the science. So what we've done is there were so many different things in Title 19 and Title 24 and Title 14 that helped bring all of those things together. But as a building official or a homeowner, trying to figure out all the things you had to do to meet Chapter 7A was arduous. So what we decided to do was pull all of those things together into one part of the building code. So if you know, there's parts and then there's chapters, and we were under a chapter or under a part in a chapter before. We've elevated the stature of the building requirement, and now it's its own part, Part 7. And again, that will go into effect January 1st of 2026, and it brings all of those codes together in one place. So as a building official or homeowner or a contractor looking to build to these standards, you don't have to go search around in multiple books and titles and all these things. It's all in one place. So we're really excited that our code development and analysis team was able to work with the Building Standards Commission to get that across the finish line. So excited for that to happen. Some other efforts are the real estate disclosures, which I've talked a little bit about already, so I won't belabor that. But our low-cost retrofit list, homeowners have the option of going on our website, and we have a document there to help people, like, as an example, during the day, if you go into your garage and close the garage door, and if your garage doesn't seal flat to the ground and you can see light coming in under the gasket, you need to replace that, because as embers and wind are blown at your house, those embers are going to come in where that light's coming in. They're going to be able to make it through there, and they're going to ignite whatever material you keep in your garage. So, or caulking on the side of your home with a fire-resistive caulking, which they do make, to help seal up gaps and cracks on the outside of your home to ensure that those embers that are just pelting your house don't amount to enough heat energy that then would ignite that siding. So these are all steps among many others that are on that low-cost retrofit that give homeowners the ability to take that first step. Because what we found is that if homeowners are empowered with options of taking a step, because that's oftentimes they just like, I don't know where to start. What's the most important thing? Well, the most important thing is also the most expensive thing, which is your roof. And then it's your siding, and then it's your windows, and then it's your vents, all of which are costly. And a lot of us, when we're faced with making decisions about braces for our kids, medicine for our animals, school, gas for our car, food on our table, and then we're asking people to spend tens of thousands of dollars to retrofit their home just for the maybe to get insurance, maybe not. It makes it really tough. It's a challenge. But what we found is if we can present them ideas that are low cost, that give them that first step, and they feel a sense of accomplishment. Okay, I did something. They tend to start to want to do more, and they start to ask more questions about what can I do to be more wildfire prepared. And then finally on this slide is our home hardening financial assistance program, which is called technically our California Wildfire Mitigation Financial Assistance Program, or CWMP for short. This is a joint program between Cal OES and Cal Fire. It's a joint powers authority, of which I am the board chair for. And what we are providing is direct financial assistance to homeowners, around $40,000, to retrofit their home to make it more wildfire resilient. And that includes completely doing a defensible space for them, ensuring that that's done first. And then we focus on the home. So it could be a new roof, it could be siding, it could be windows, it could be a combination of all of those things, based on what we can do for that $40,000-ish for them. And this is at no cost to the homeowners. And we are leveraging state dollars, of which we were appropriated $50 million by the legislature. We're leveraging that against hazard mitigation grant dollars from FEMA. Our first two projects, we got a 75-25 match, 75 the federal government, 25 for the state. The next four projects, we got a 90-10 match. So our money's going exponentially further than it would have if we used state-only dollars. And I'm proud to announce in our first 18 months, we retrofitted one home. It took us a while to build the plane while we were flying it. I mean, we had nothing. Nobody had done this in the nation before, a financial assistance program for home hardening. We look to our partners in other things that have done things like Brace and Bolt and others to help kind of develop the program. But we had to come up with the financial application program, the assessment application where you go out and actually conduct the assessment, come up with outreach materials, frequently asked questions, vendor contracts, contractor lists, the documents for the closeouts for the contractors, working with FEMA to leverage those dollars. So it really took us a long time to ramp up the program, but happy to announce the first, as I mentioned, the first 18 months, one home. In the last 12 months, we've done 60 homes, and that number is just going to exponentially increase. Lake County is out in the front. By next month, I just heard from the supervisor in Lake County, they're expecting to be doing 9 homes a month. So really excited about this. We're piloting it in six counties right now. We plan to, once we've built this out and we strategically chose various different types of organizations, NGOs, and county government to help understand like the different complexities related to each one. So when we open this broadly up to the state, anybody that comes to us, we can hand them all the information, say, well, here's what they did, and here's what they did, and here's how they overcame that obstacle. So all that material will be presented to them. So really excited about that program because it's for providing actual help to people, and we're saturating neighborhoods and not doing these kind of patchwork quilt things that don't really affect make that much change, but doing whole communities and really getting everybody engaged. And it just takes that one. Once you start doing one and they see what you do, then they're like, oh, okay, that's really cool. I want to do that. And it's free. Yeah, it's free. So there was a little hesitation. Of course, we're with the government. We're here to help. Attitude, they're like, oh, sure, this is going to cost me. But we've been able to bridge that gap, fortunately. So now transitioning to that slide I mentioned about the embers pelting your home. This, I hope a lot of you have seen this image before. This is from the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety. They have a lab in South Carolina where they can reproduce this. They can reproduce every natural peril in this facility, from wind, hail, tornadic winds, embers, wildfire. All of that can be done in this facility. They have 300 horsepower fans that can go up to 145 miles per hour wind. It's incredible facility, the only one like it in the nation. And what they've found is, through their research, if you can see the amount of heat energy at the bottom of that structure, that first 6 inches at the base of your structure is imperative that be non-combustible, or there be some flashing or be something there. But as you can see, as you transition out to the arc and the curve around away from the home, that roughly equates to about 5 feet. And there's enough heat energy left in those embers to be able to ignite organic material, dead or alive, that will, and we've seen this replicated time and time again. So this is a part of our research arm that we're helping fund through the National Institute for Standards and Technology, Underwriters Laboratory, the Fire Safety Research Institute, and IBHS to help reinforce these things. Another thing we're really excited about is our structure separation experiment, or what we call SSE. So we are funding, CAL FIRE is funding this experiment through IBHS to look at ADUs, sheds, and then full-size homes, the distances they need to be away from one another to be able to survive, and those building construction features that actually make a difference. So in this scenario, this is I think it's a 18 by 10 wood frame structure like you would get at Home Depot or Lowe's or Tough Shed or any of those name sheds that had some fuel in it. But as you can see, all the instrumentation that we have here everywhere. This is set at 20 feet away from the structure, and we're measuring in the eaves, we're measuring inside the home, we're measuring outside the home, everywhere for the amount of heat. In this particular instance, we had wind coming from the right to the left toward the structure at 12 miles per hour, and we were looking at everything: the heat flux, the energy, the amount of heat that home was taking, the time at which it took for the building to burn. We never actually got the home to ignite, thank goodness. But what we saw were vinyl gutters. These sagged tremendously. One part of it started to ignite in the center, and then these windows started to degrade, these vinyl windows, and started to fall out. So there were some embers that were starting to get inside this home. So what there are some preliminary results, but this is a multi-phase, multi-year experiment that we're doing. Right now we're on sheds. Next is ADUs, and then next are full-size homes, the distances they need to be away from one another. And we're not just doing a single type of home. So these are we have, I think, 7 different configurations of full-size homes like the one you see here, whether it's a combustible siding, metal gutters, different configurations of windows, whether that's fiberglass, fiber cement, metal in the form of aluminum. So we're trying to do every different style and type of home to determine what the best components are to make your home more wildfire resilient, and at what distances do those things need to be, everything from the sheds, the ADUs, to the homes. And we're really looking at density. This is going to become an issue as California continues to expand, and we want to meet our RENA numbers and create more homes. But at what cost? If we keep putting homes 10 feet away from each other, only 5 feet on each side, in the event, and those types of events that happen in Southern California, are we really doing those people a favor, or do we need to be putting those homes a little bit further apart? So we're hoping that this really informs those decisions as we move forward. So some kind of next steps here. We are updating the fire hazard maps. I know we just did that, but when we created the LRA maps that just came out earlier this year, because we just updated the state responsibility area, the area in which CAL FIRE has direct financial assistance for suppression of wildfires, that those lines changed between there and the LRA. So it left some gaps in what's defined in the SRA versus the LRA. So we're going to work on cleaning that up over the next few months. Of course, the Zone 0 defensible space regs, working with the Board of Forestry and Fire Protection to get that across the finish line, hopefully to meet the governor's intent of his executive order. Continuing on the structures, well, I didn't mention this, the structure susceptibility modeling. So we just talked about the structure separation experiment, but this is really about risk modeling. So I've mentioned a lot about fire hazard severity zone modeling. We're really wanting to get into the risk modeling space at parcel level risk, so that people understand, and communities and neighborhoods understand their risk based on parcels, and giving that community a score, and working with them annually for all the things that they do to help reduce that risk number. You could be at 90% risk as a community, and you get that number and you're like, oh my God, we have to do something. And our hope is that as a community, they seek out grants or opportunities or help, and they lower that risk score down and get it to an acceptable rate that insurance companies and others will recognize and be able to look at and get a certification from CAL FIRE that says you've done this and you've met this standard. So we're working on that now, working with some third-party vendors to get a baseline modeling assessment for the state. It's just going to take us a little while to gather all the data. We're really working on insurance alignments. There's not a lot of alignment in some cases about what the priorities are. So it leaves homeowners a little vague on what they feel like they should prioritize, because maybe one insurance company says, hey, we really want you to do this, and then they get a quote from another one and they're like, hey, we really need you to do this, and they might not always be in alignment in those cases. So really trying to kind of work in that space to see if we can come up with some SOPs to help get the really for the public to understand what the most important things are. Constantly working on land use planning, ensuring that we're building more safe, more fire resilient communities for the future, and putting those policies and procedures and understandings in place. Training, this is not just for CAL FIRE, but training of the public. The public needs to understand what it means to live in a WUI space and what it means to live near a WUI space, and what they need to do to be ready to go. We call for structure fires, we call it EDITH, exit drills in the house, and and we have ready, set, go for people to understand what those types of things mean. But now we need to come up with a WUI mantra too about what those things mean. And then of course, continuing on research, pouring a bunch of money and time and effort into the development and cultivation of really research science-backed data, so that people can make the most informed decision for where they live and what they're doing. So that was a brief overview of what I do on a daily basis, and turn back to our team here of our small but mighty, roughly 313 people who accomplish all the things I mentioned at the beginning of our event here. So with that, Keith, I'm done, so I'll turn it back to you.
Wonderful. That was a fabulous talk, Chief Bigelow. Some amazing work, and you're talking to Canadians, where 330 people is not a small army. That's a nice-sized army of people. But congratulations on really thorough program. So far, we have one question from our attendees, and I've got about 10. So I'm going to ask you the one question that has popped up in the Q&A, and then I'll turn to all of mine. And I'll come back to attendees if people ask more questions. So Devin Jones says, thanks so much for your presentation. What do you consider to be the minimum viable resolution for a map looking to assess fire hazard severity at the property level? And what's the resolution of your maps?
So for the fire hazard maps, we use a 30-meter resolution. But as we're working with the vendor that we're working with now for the structure susceptibility modeling I just mentioned there at the end for our next steps, that's one of the components that we're working with them on, of at what granularity does this really need to be most effective. And we don't have an answer to that yet. This is a new initiative. We're just getting started with them in the development of this process. But I can assure you it's going to be less than 30-meter resolution to really to hone in. One of the things, a lot of people say, well, why don't you just use satellite imagery to do these assessments? And you can to a certain degree, and we don't discount that. But we go a lot of steps further in just looking at an overhead picture. And we want to take an accurate accounting of what a structure looks like pre-fire, the building component features, because in my program, we also do what's called damage assessment, so post-emergency evaluations. So in the event that you have a catastrophic event, I don't care if it's flood, fire, tornado, earthquake, we come in and do that post-emergency assessment to determine structural viability and what happened to it. So if we have all of those building construction features ahead of time, it makes it a lot easier, especially in a wildfire environment when you're looking at a white pile of ash and we're asking, well, did it have screens? What size were the screens? Did it have enclosed eaves? Well, you can't tell those things when it's a pile of ash. So there are things that will never eliminate the boots on the ground. But as far as to answer your question, no, don't know what that will look like in this next iteration.
Awesome, thanks. So Andre Mendez asks, could you elaborate on what the fire hazard severity zone model enhancements would be necessary to capture urban conflagration potential? For example, are the models, the vendors that you're talking to, are they going to be including buildings in the fuel?
So no, and not yet. What we've found is in all the people we've talked to, there are too many variables in structure configuration to make the model as accurate as it needs to be. So for the vegetation, we've been, as a race, been studying vegetation for thousands of years. Like, we know how a manzanita burns, and because we can tell through LiDAR data the fuel moisture content in specific vegetation types across the landscape in California, which we do routinely. So we're able to, and we have remote automated weather systems, or RAWs, that take fuel moisture content, and we look at those things and incorporate that when we do our fire modeling. So we can tell you in the vegetation how it's going to burn based on that modeling. But when we go to structures, that becomes very different in what the fuel moisture content of a home is based on its age, the size and configuration, the construction features of that home. We may know what originally or how originally it was built, but people do retrofits all the time that they don't necessarily get permits for. And now they may have made their home more wildfire resilient that may change the output of the model that we had no idea about. So it becomes a challenge to try to accurately model house-to-house conflagration. That's not to say we're giving up, because we're not. We're going to keep moving this needle forward. It's just to say that right now, as a part of our risk, that structure susceptibility modeling, when I say structure susceptibility, it's what it's susceptible to outside of the home, not necessarily the susceptibility of the house itself. It's all the things around it that would make it susceptible to wildfire. So we're going to keep working towards that. I mean, it's a huge focus of ours to try to answer that question. We'll get there. It's just we're not there yet.
Understood. An anonymous attendee asks about whether you're going to include climate change in the maps, in the modeling, etc.
Yeah, so that's it's a very broad term of climate change. What I can tell you is that every time we do our model, we use the latest weather, and we go back 20 years, 50 years of weather data. So those ebbs and flows that happen with the weather and the climate are taken into account by using that length and duration of weather included in that. So not knowing exactly what part of climate change that you mean to incorporate, I hope that answers your question by yes, we're taking into account that duration of time.
Well, I don't think that's what the speaker, the attendee meant. I think the attendee meant was referring to the expectation that we are not in a stationary climate, that there is a long-term trend, that we are headed towards higher temperatures in North America, presumably longer fire seasons, presumably hotter extremes.
Yeah, so great. Thank you. That's a great clarification. So the short answer is for that, we're not forward-looking. It's not like like some of the catastrophe modeling that's trying to do forward-looking. Right now, we are looking at historical precedent of what's happened because we know that and we can incorporate that. So when somebody points to us and says, "Well, how'd you get that?" Well, we used all this. If we just came up with something that's like, "Oh, well, we think it's going to do this," even though we may all know that those things you just said are probably going to come true, there's no articulable way for us to prove that that's going to be what's happening. And if somebody could poke a hole in our model by saying, well, I don't agree with that. I think it's going to only go up by 2 degrees. And you said it's going to go up by 2.7 degrees. So if we look back in historical data, we can say empirically, no, this is exactly what happened. So I would love to be able to do that. I just don't think that our model would stand the pressure or the scrutiny of the peer review if we did that.
I see. Okay. So another attendee, I hope I'm going to pronounce this correctly, Chaidash Kafali, says, thanks very much, Chief. You've mentioned about how you're considering scoring communities. Can you please elaborate a little bit about what constitutes a community, how you define boundaries and so on? I think you had one slide that touched on that a little bit.
Yeah, and yes, so that's a great question. And so in CAL FIRE, we work in a decentralized command. So there's programmatically, I have programmatic oversight for over 20 programs for CAL FIRE. But for the implementation of those, they happen at what we call a unit level, of which there are 21 units across the state of California. Some are single county, some are multiple counties that have geographic responsibility for that area. And they set the priorities, they set the objectives, they do the practical implementation, the emergency response, the fuels reduction management, all of that stuff. So they would work with their local jurisdiction, their county, in essence, to define those areas. And that's what we're going to be looking at for them to do, is to define those communities, because in some areas they're very rural and people are just spread apart. And it's commonly known as, let's say, like where I live, in O'Neill's. But unless you go by like a zip code in California that would kind of define that area, you wouldn't really know where the boundary of O'Neill's is. It's just kind of known as a little map dot. But then there are other areas of the state that are very clearly defined. This is the community of Mariposa, as an example, in our gold country. So we'll be working with them to help us define those communities and make sure that we capture everybody. But there's no specific definition. This is one of the things I've harped on for years, is there is no definition of community, of what that means. So I'm hoping as a part of this effort that we can come up with collectively in the state a definition of that, of what a community is and what constitutes a neighborhood, and what those boundaries are supposed to look like as a best practice.
And speaking of definitions, you talked about, the maps showed yellow was moderate and orange was high and red was very high. And presumably white is not yet mapped or won't be mapped until something happens. But what do moderate, high, and very high mean qualitatively or quantitatively? Or do they have quantitative definitions, and how did you arrive at them?
Well, that would be a better answer for our scientists to answer. But yes, there is a very specific definition of that, and we have some very smart environmental scientists that worked on that would give you the more scientific answer. And I do know that definition is on the Fire Hazard Severity Zone website, the fire.ca.gov/FHSE. So I know you'll be able to find that answer on there. I don't think I could rattle that off the top of my head.
Okay, good enough. An anonymous attendee asked, what are your thoughts on the use of exterior sprinklers in the protection of buildings and problematic areas of subdivisions during wildfires? And the speaker, the attendee asks about pre-installed or rapidly deployed, perhaps in conjunction with other aspects of hardening and mitigation.
Yeah, so I think they have a role to play for sure. In a rapidly expanding wildfire scenario like we saw in Southern California in January, I think those would have been less effective because of the amount of wind that we were seeing in 100-mile-per-hour winds. Even, I mean, having sprinklers on, that wind is going to push that water probably not to its intended target, but in a different direction. And then it's complicated by the fact that there was a lot of talk about water and water availability for those two areas. But what happens is when you get an urban conflagration and you get multiple houses that have now burned, oftentimes those pipes in those areas, they were probably all metal because they were really old from the 40s from the 40s on up. I mean, ran the gamut. So those homes are now burned, and then newer ones that have PVC piping or even PEX piping, now those are all open holes that have no way to shut off the water. So when you have 6,000 homes that are burning and all that water is coming straight out, and the municipal pumps are trying to keep up with supplying all those homes with water, and then supplying all the firefighting resources that are trying to fill hundreds and hundreds of gallons of water in their tanks at a time, no wonder it failed. No municipal water system was built for a catastrophic event like that. Most of them are built to sustain 1 to 3 structure fires at a time. That's just how those municipal systems are built in the state of California. So, and the amount of money that would have to be gone into to develop a system that could handle 6,000 open holes at a time would be tremendous, and it would be cost prohibitive. So to add then sprinklers on where we're now expelling more water, I think as I mentioned in the beginning, I think it has a place, especially proactively when you know a fire's coming toward you. As an example, in the Garnet fire in Central California, McKinley Grove, where they have the giant sequoias, they knew the fire was coming that way. They deployed sprinklers 1 week ahead before the fire got there and soaked the area around it to ensure that if the fire did make it, it would be less intense and it wouldn't ignite. So absolutely sprinklers have a role. But do I think that it should be used as a primary wildland suppression resource? Not in all cases.
Okay. I had a question that overlaps with a question that an attendee asked. About 5 years ago, Steve Hawks presented CAL FIRE data from the Paradise Fire. And he presented this wonderful chart of odds ratios, how this, that, and the other feature, non-combustible roof, non-combustible siding, etc., changed or affected ignition probability, the probability that your house will burn given that it's inside a fire perimeter. And what kind of roof you had a effect of magnitude of 6 times increase or decrease in the chance that your house was going to burn. And there were a number of other features that had odds ratios on the order of 1/2 or 2. Those features did not include Zone Zero. Zone Zero postdates the 2018 data, and none of them seemed to matter in the Eaton fire. I didn't see. I mean, it was as if non-combustible siding was irrelevant. If you looking at the what burned and what didn't. That's my impression based on examination of about 100 houses at the edge of the fire. So my impression may be wrong, but that was my impression, that they didn't matter. Do you have a sense of, am I right about that? And if so, why? What was different about the Eaton fire than Paradise that made those features not seem to matter?
That's a great question. I have Steve Hawks is a great friend of mine, and I took his position after he retired, and then subsequently moved up beyond that. But I remember, and I still have that slide, and we talked about deck on grade, no deck on grade. I mean, there were windows, and there was a whole bunch of things in that probabilistic model that Will Brewer did. And that, again, largely was based on the 2017 and maybe one 2018 fire. I think you saw a lot of parallels between what we saw in Altadena, the Altadena community, and the Palisades community with what we saw in the city of Paradise. Is that we had these anomaly foehn wind conditions that were insurmountable, and there are times where weather will outgun mitigations, and we see that time and time again. And we can go down the list of even going back to 2003 and the Cedar Fire in Southern California, or we can go into the Highway Fire in 2017, or go to 2000 the T Fire, or the list goes on and on, where we have these anomaly wind conditions that we have to account for, as I mentioned, in the modeling, but they are overpowering. They're overpowering. And unless we're building concrete homes with metal roofs, there are always going to be susceptibilities in building in wildfire-prone areas. Now, having said that, that's the doom and gloom. There are things that we can do that we're learning from, and that's things like clearing the vegetation around your home. And by creating, when you have 10 feet between the homes and you have a wood fence, now that wood fence now catches on fire because the home next to it caught on fire, which even creates more heat and energy and now makes that home more susceptible. But if we had a different barrier between those two homes that was non-combustible, or of brick, or of some kind of other material that would create as a heat buffer that wouldn't allow that radiant heat transfer, that would provide more time for that home to withstand a wildfire, those types of things would make a big difference. So there are things, and as what I think our structure separation experiment is going to tell us, is that 10 feet is too close. Mm-hmm. Like, it's just too close to build homes next to one another. So we're getting smarter in the research and the science realm. We're getting smarter in the practical application of the statutes by removing combustible material from directly around your home. That's going to make a huge difference, because if you went through the community of Altadena and Pasadena before the fire, every one of those homes had a tremendous amount of fuel right up next to them.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that is a huge contributing factor. So I don't have a backwards looking ball, or even a crystal ball to look forward to say that if they would have all removed all that fuel around every one of those homes, what the outcome would have been, if it would have been different. But I can say, personally, I think it would have. I think it would have made a difference in the amount of distance that fire would have traveled, because in essence, it runs out of ignitable material that those embers are now igniting ahead of time, that pre-dry out all those homes and pre-dry out all those fuels, that then make them explode with fire when the fire actually makes it to them. So it it's just going to be a challenge as we move forward for social acceptance. As I mentioned, the emotional attachment with all of that stuff. But I think as we start to build back, we just have to be more smart in how we do it.
Yeah, I was. You anticipated my follow up. In none of those 100 houses was there zone zero compliance. None of the 100 houses that I looked at. In every single case, fuel was right up against the house, and not just in isolated spots in many places. Which means, as you said, there's no crystal ball. We can't look backward, can't look forward to see empirical data to support the argument that pulling out all that vegetation is going to, or has made a big difference. Now, we've got those wonderful laboratory tests by IBHS, did the two side-by-side houses, and one has fuel right up to the house and one has the compliant zone zero, and the dragons are firing sparks and the non-compliant house, ignites, and the compliant house doesn't. But that's one experiment. Are you gonna? I mean, and it'll be great that when let us hope that the zone zero requirements and the governor's executive order makes a difference. Let us hope that it will make a difference. I think we have reasonable belief that it will. But am I forgetting anything? Are there other experiments to support the empirically the argument that zone zero reduces ignition probability substantially?
Yeah, I think UC Berkeley, Michael Gollner just published a report on the August 28th so there are quite a few people in this space that are looking at that and re-emphasizing that. And so I think Michael Gollner's is observations based on not actual empirical science that he's doing or research, but I mean it's research in the context of everything they're saying is what's actually happening. So it just kind of further reinforces what we're talking about. But there are other efforts through NIST, the National Institute for Standards and Technology. They put out several technical notes related to this. Most recently, their campfire walkthrough, and where they talk about these exact things about why these homes burned down, and they talk about evacuation routes and the how 85 people unfortunately perished as a result of not being able to evacuate. So there's a whole plethora. I think there's 5 different technical notes related to that, 3 of which speak specifically about the fuels and the distance for structures and fences and all those things. I think Underwriters Laboratory, as I mentioned, the Fire Safety Research Institute with Derek Alconis and Dan Gorham and others are doing a tremendous job in components of that. So not specifically related to 0 to 5 foot, like empirical but the components related to 0 to 5. So like the windows, they're in the 0 to 5, like what those need to be least susceptible, and what the gutters need to be, what the vents need to be, what all those things start to matter and just add to the validity of the 0 to 5 and why it's important.
Awesome. Let's see. Can you talked about how undesirable vinyl window frames are. The challenge, of course, is market availability of alternatives.
Yeah.
Is the market moving toward increasing availability? Have you seen more compliant window frames or less combustible window frames coming onto the market in California?
Yeah, my wife and I just built a home. We just moved in 4 months ago. We'd been building for 2.5 years. And we chose to go with a company that did aluminum exterior and wood interior. And that was never even an issue. They just said, what do you want? And here are your choices. And we gave them the plans and they said, no problem, here you go. So from personal experience, I didn't experience that market availability issue. Although we only went to 2 different companies. But both of which said, yeah, we can do that. And because I knew we wanted non-combustible or which in the form of aluminum on the outside. So that was No, I haven't experienced that market shortage.
Awesome, thanks. I am super interested in the parcel level risk modeling work that you're contracting out. Can you tell us any more about who's doing that and where we can learn
Yes.
more?
Yeah. So there will be a press release coming out soon, I believe. It's through Vibrant Planet. That's the vendor we're using, and they're helping us model that. And I believe a lot of what they're doing, you can follow on their website, and they have some tools available now that are open source or free that we're helping inform through this pilot with them. As I mentioned, we have 21 operational units in the state. We're piloting this in 2 of those units, one of which is our Amador El Dorado unit, which is kind of north central, kind of just south and east of Sacramento. And then we're also doing it in San Diego, in the far southern part of the state, to get a sense of much different fuel environments and much different climate and topography and all kinds of different challenges. So we wanted to get a sense for how it reacted in each one of those before we broadened it out to the rest of the state.
Awesome. You mentioned some mandatory retrofits, like the mandatory compliance with Zone 0. Could you recap the full extent of mandatory retrofits, and can you tell me, do you think there are enough?
So there are, and maybe I misspoke. So there's no mandatory or laws requiring retrofitting. So there are, I think when I showed that graph of what with the green on the state responsibility area, and then on the left was the LRA and the Chapter 7A, the building code. That was probably for new construction. It would be nothing retrospectively or retroactively, excuse me, to those areas. So there are no laws, no regulations, no statutes, nothing that require a homeowner to upgrade their home to the current standard. Now, there may be local ordinances that say if you're doing X, you also need to do Y and Z in order to get your permit. So, but that's not something the state requires. That would be something a local jurisdiction would adopt by ordinance to require those homeowners to do that. But there's nothing in law that says they have to from the state.
So that executive order for Zone 0 compliance, that's not retroactive.
For Zone 0, yes, because defensible space is required for everyone in the state responsibility area, and then everyone who lives in the very high fire hazard severity zone. So as soon as that goes into effect, it becomes required for all of those that it applies to.
Okay, so if you live in the very high mapped area, come January 1st or sometime in the coming year, you got to pull out the fuel and the vegetation that's within 5 feet of your house.
Yes, so in the very high, you will be required to, for new construction, as soon as it goes into effect. So all new construction will be required to do it.
Oh, but not existing homes that are already there. Okay.
No. So the law will go into effect for them in 2 years, or excuse me, in 1 year, but we can't actually enforce it based on statute for 3 years. So in 2029, that's when we can actually enforce it for the built environment.
And I realize that a public employee has to be very careful about appearing to make policy recommendations. What do you think what can you say about the existing buildings in the very high and high hazard areas? I mean, can you tell us, was consideration given to mandating changes to existing buildings, to mandatory retrofit? If so, what were the sort of pros and cons, and why did no change sort of win?
And when you're talking about retrofits for the homes themselves,
the homes, like I mean, presumably there was a conversation that said, okay, shall we require existing homes in the very high mapped places? Shall we require them to pull out vegetation, comply with Zone 0? And there must have been a big argument. I'm imagining that there was a big argument about it, and in the end, I I'm imagining somebody said, so that's not going to work and let's not push it. But that's just my guess.
Yes. So when this law was passed, 3074, AB 3074 from Friedman, we convened a group. We, being the Board of Forestry, led it, and we participated. But there was like a 13-member group that represented from different fire officials and local jurisdictions. And we came up with what we thought was a good draft language. We took it to the Board of Forestry. The board said, oh, this is great, but did you talk to this person? Did you talk to this person? Did you talk to this person? We were like, no, we didn't. They said, okay, well, why don't you convene those people and spread this out and then come back to us? So that 13-member group expanded to like a 36-member group. So even more representatives from local government, from local fire service, from industry professionals, from the public, just really trying to get as many voices as we possibly could to ensure that what we were doing made sense. And what the overwhelming, resounding response was in the local responsibility area, of which there are millions of homes, versus in the state responsibility area, there's 850,000. We're now, these folks are like, this will never work. Like, this isn't enforceable for us. We're not going to be able to do this. We need time to be able to implement this. Like, we can't just wave a wand and have enough people to go do this now. So this was a huge change for them, and I guess those voices won in the argument. Hey, we need more time to be able to implement this if we're going to do it this way.
That makes sense. Enforceability can be a huge barrier. Yeah. Okay. Now, in this last 4 minutes or so, I'm going to ask our attendees to put into the Q&A a 1 to 5. How much do you think Canada needs to imitate California in this regard? Was where 1 is no way, I don't think this is a good idea, to 5 is yes, please, very much, and 3 is I don't have a strong opinion about it. While people are doing that, Chief Bigelow, do you have any final thoughts that you want to leave us with? Any sort of, if we take away one thing from your talk, what would that one thing be?
Well, I think what we've seen across the country and even into Canada, into British Columbia, and even in Quebec, what we've seen is wildfire isn't a California problem. Wildfire is a worldwide problem. We've been all over the world talking with so many, even Ireland came to us and said, hey, we need some help. And we're like, Ireland, you're all green? Like, do you really need wildland fire help? And they're like, yeah, we have fires. We need help. So, I mean, it goes from Greece to Portugal to Peru. I mean, we've been everywhere and talking to people about this. And what we found consistently is we're all fighting the same challenge, right? We're all fighting this wildfire problem. And a lot of what it boils down to is no one group, no one organization, no one government entity can solve this by themselves. It takes all of us collectively with the same message, pointing in the same direction, including the public, to have personal accountability for their property and being good stewards of the land, being good land managers, to participate in this overall, to solve this overall problem. And I just can't emphasize enough early engagement of all parties involved and getting them all at the table and talking about this, because what we do in California might not work in Canada. It might not, and that's fine. But there are things we can learn from one another about how we can approach things, how we can talk to people, how we can engage people. And I think the biggest thing, is just early engagement of everyone, because it's an us problem. It's not a you, it's not a me problem. Awesome.
Chief Bigelow, thank you so much. This was a great talk, very engaging. And I'm going to remind everybody that the recording is going to be up at www.iclr.org/workshops within the next day or so. And let everybody just remind everyone that in next month's Friday Forum, Tina Neal is going to tell us about BC's Disaster and Climate Risk and Resilience Assessment. It's going to be on Friday, October the 10th, 2025 at the same time, 1 p.m. Eastern. Thanks everybody for attending. Thanks again, Chief Bigelow, for a wonderful talk.
Thanks for this
Bye-bye,
opportunity.
everyone.
Goodbye.
Ciao.